Hey everybody, welcome to today's webinar on fatigue. And the title of today's webinar is Beat the Burnout, your fast track guide to feeling energized again. So excited to be sharing this with you and the work that we've done on fatigue and energy metabolism at the DRIPBaR. I'm Dr. Steve Rallis. I'm Chief Medical Officer of the DRIPBaR, and I have the privilege of working with the entire medical team, right from the medical directors to the nurses, in helping provide those formulations, both for the IVs and IMs, and off-label, including full script supplementation and complete protocols to help every single client that walks into a drip bar experience the absolute best result. So without further ado, let's get into today's webinar. Why does fatigue matter? Fatigue is really kind of like the holy grail in terms of patient symptomatology. It's related to almost every single disease outcome. It's very poorly managed, significant losses in productivity. It can implicate and indicate so many other associated comorbidities or other disease states that it's really important. And most importantly, it matters to you. Fatigue is often the symptom, and it can be the first symptom, it can be a continuous symptom, but it's often related to a more serious underlying condition. And without sort of being ultimately, dramatic or macabre, my practice is in primarily in supportive cancer care or integrative oncology, and fatigue is related to every single step of that, right from early onset diagnoses to the patients going through the standard of care, whether that's chemo, radiation, palliative care, the entire spectrum. Fatigue is one of the chief concerns. So we're going to dive into this and we're going to explain it in very clear terms, and especially in terms of functional medicine, why you're experiencing fatigue. Now, I want to have a little bit of a roadmap for today's webinar. I want to unpack why you're tired. So we need to find, and from understanding that, including using labs, which you can ask your primary care doctor for, or you can ask one of the providers through a drip bar to help you get those labs. But we need to figure out what exactly is causing the fatigue. From there, we want to be able to find the perfect drip for you. So we want to build a treatment plan from that perfect drip. And we also want to know, beyond the IV bag, what are other things that you can do? At the end of this webinar, I'm going to share a very special offer as well for having listened to the entire webinar. You're going to be rewarded with a very special offer. So stick through this right to the end. You'll be glad that you did. So let's diagnose it. Battery is low. What's draining your energy reserves? So is it hormones? We're going to talk about the development of the IV formulas and the rationale behind them, but I'm going to give you sort of like a bit of a bird's eye view first as to some of the thinking that went into this so that you can understand exactly in terms of functional medicine where our minds were at when we were developing this. So the impetus for this really is in primary care. So when we're assessing a patient, we have to go through this differential. Differential means all of the different things that could be possibly causing this patient's fatigue. So conventional medicine is very good at looking at the most nefarious reasons for this, loss in blood, severe anemia, etc. But we need to look at things along a sliding spectrum or from a functional perspective. So is it the adrenal glands? The adrenal glands are pumping out cortisol. They're always under continuous stress in our environment, which ultimately leads to cortisol dysregulation. And with cortisol dysregulation, you then end up affecting every single hormone cascade down the line. Your thyroid becomes functionally hypothyroid. We're going to touch on that. Testosterone decreases, DHEA decreases, and this goes on and on and on. Is it a frank nutrient deficiency? B12, very common. And again, with digestive issues, the one thing that happens is because most of our nutrients are very tightly regulated, as our gut health decreases, so does our nutrient absorption. One of the reasons why people love going to drip bars is because, very simply, they can absorb the nutrients. So if you're bypassing digestion, which is compromised in a lot of people, most, then you're getting the impact of those nutrients and you're topping up those nutrients in a much more profound way. So B12 is a typical culprit. So is zinc. So is ferritin, magnesium as well, selenium, vitamin D. The list goes on and on and on. Vitamin D really as a ladder, we could talk about it in the hormone cascade because vitamin D is really more of a prohormone, which affects the cascade of other hormones, including thyroid, testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, etc. Is there something else going on? Is it related to digestive issues, GI issues, liver, gallbladder, cardiovascular, etc.? Is it affected oxygen and oxygen saturation in the body and in the tissues, the brain? These are things that really need to be assessed as well. Is it lifestyle or how? It's always lifestyle, but really the question is, or the better clinical question might be, how is your lifestyle affecting your energy stores? So what's your stress levels like? How are you managing those stress levels? What are you doing to offset the damage or the demand to those organ systems? Hydration. Hydration really cannot be understated. Or overstated. When you think of the amount of fatigue that is really just chronic dehydration, and there are so many clinical cases in drip bars where patients really just start using hydration, whether that's lactated ringers, normal saline, and they begin to feel a world better. And with the revamp, really, of the IVs that we've reformulated all of the IVs to make them better. But one of the things that we did that's really, really, really super important is we modified the osmolarity. Now, the osmolarity is really just the concentration of nutrients in an IV that creates how it's absorbed. Is it absorbed into the bloodstream? Is it absorbed into the cells? And that osmolarity is really key for hydration. So we reformulated it so that they would be more hydrating because we know we're dealing with chronic dehydration in our society. Nutrition and nutritional status. We talked about that in the previous slide. Sleep. We don't sleep enough. We seem to, really, we seem to over glorify working super hard, not sleeping. We see this in our residents as an example. I really think that we need to step back and really sort of place a bigger emphasis on normal patterns and normal rhythms, including sleep. Because again, we see this in shift workers, we see this in our paramedics, we see this in firefighters, we see this in factory workers. Like I said, we see it in our medical residents. Poor sleep begins to affect everything else. So it begins to affect the cascade of everything, including how our body releases cortisol, affects our hormones, affects our sleep. It begins to create a vicious cycle. And toxicity. Toxicity is a completely, we're living in a toxic world. And whether that's overconsumption of plastics, whether that's estrogen modifiers or estrogen mimickers, whether that is toxicity in our food supply, whether it's toxic exposure, whether it's everything that we're exposed to, really, we don't have um, the genetic or even the epigenetic operating system to really properly take that, absorb it, process it, and excrete it. And that's why, again, for most of us that all methylate at various different levels, and methylation is really critical to detoxification in the liver, in the gut, through the kidneys. And as each of us have different abilities to detoxify, we can begin to see disease states in earlier and earlier cohorts. It's not uncommon in my practice to see cancer patients, which we were seeing at much later ages, but at much earlier ages. Colorectal cancer, ages 30, 32, 28, same with breast cancer, early 30s, even with no family history, no BRCA gene positivity. But again, they can be estrogen positive, progesterone positive, triple positive. The list goes on and on. But again, most because of toxicity, and our body's ability. And one of the things that I'm proudest of in our work through the DRIPBaR is in creating formulas and IVs that facilitate detoxification. We're going to talk about that in this webinar as well. So naturally, the labs to consider would be things like a complete blood count, which would be red blood cell count and the white blood cell count, and all of the various components of red blood cells and the various different components of white blood cells. B12, very important. I typically like to measure folic acid when I measure B12. Zinc, also important. And with zinc, typically I balance that with copper. So I like to see what the copper levels are and zinc levels. Ferritin, or the storage form of iron, electrolytes, kidney function. These are basic. This would be, for me, a basic nutrient panel that really needs to be done. If you think it's hormones, you need to dive deeper. Thyroid panel, really important to keep this in mind when you check your thyroid. Typically, what's measured is TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone, but it's actually T3, which is really your active form of thyroid. So you need to measure both free T4 and free T3, and even possibly reverse T3, but for sure TSH, T4, T3. Vitamin D, so 25-hydroxy vitamin D, measure that. Cortisol is a good test to measure if you think hormones are related or you think it's stress affecting your hormones. And there's normally in a normal blood panel, we'll run fasting cortisol. But really, you want to be looking at 4-point cortisol. And I'm going to show you a 4-point cortisol test in this webinar. Testosterone, free and total testosterone, DHEA, which is again a precursor hormone. And again, for females, estrogen, progesterone, and depending on where you are in the cycle, FSH or LH. Testosterone under stress in our environment, and this is true for 55-year-old females, it's true actually for 25-year-old males. Testosterone is being hijacked. I'm not sure if it's just the estrogens in our environment or if it's the chronic stress that we're under. I think it's actually more the latter, and that the estrogens in our environment are just compounding the issue. But we are seeing ridiculously low levels of testosterone. And when you see the implications of that and these other hormones that get derailed, and the implication to people's quality of life, it really is dramatic. So I would suggest that you should have those levels checked. And metabolic functioning is essentially how we absorb nutrients. And metabolic dysfunction, including high fasting insulin and inflammation, which we could use 2 lab tests, ESR, or sedimentation rate, and C-reactive protein. These are 2 non-specific markers of inflammation. And fasting insulin, I would make an argument, a good clinical argument, that probably the 3 most important lab tests that everyone should have done is fasting insulin, sedimentation rate, and C-reactive protein. You need to measure insulin, you need to measure inflammation. Then there's liver function, because again, as our metabolism or metabolic function gets derailed, the liver takes the brunt. It is the liver which is running point for most disease progression. And even in cancer, oftentimes it will first go to the liver before it goes anywhere else. The liver is what is metabolizing everything. The liver needs to be maintained for optimal health and function. So better assessments, in very simple terms, will translate to better care. So having a targeted assessment in labs, and I can't tell you how often when we're doing consults, people are quick to want to jump onto an IV, which they should. The benefits are incredible. But without knowing exactly what the lab values are, it's hard to pinpoint and custom tailor that formulation, especially if a person is dealing with an issue like fatigue, which is a chronic issue. So you want to first look at those labs and make them targeted so we can see what B12 and iron is, and look at hormones, etc. And then from there, create a targeted IV and an IV frequency. Couple that with targeted nutritional support and lifestyle support, and you have a perfect complement of therapies that will really radically improve those components which are driving the fatigue. So this really is a gold standard approach. So let's dig into it. And part of digging into this is I'm laying the groundwork or the roadmap to help everybody that's watching this webinar too understand how we came up with these new IV formulas like the Power Pack. This will be very important to understand. So I started with mitochondria when we were looking at these formulations. The mitochondria produces our ATP. ATP is life. ATP is the energy source that runs every single step along the way. So when we think of mitochondria, it's the power pack, it's the producer of energy, it's the producer of ATP. ATP equals life. And if you damage your mitochondria, you decrease ATP production. So that would be decreased energy production. And in very simple terms, if you mitochondria shuts down, you shut down. And I'll share an interesting story. Years ago, maybe I'll say almost 10 years ago, when we started really looking at mitochondrial diseases, which we weren't prior to, there was a lot of physicians that were really skeptical about this, and which I would encounter. And the analogy or the example that I always use that we all are familiar with is cyanide, the classic poison. Very simple molecule, hydrogen cyanide. Now, cyanide, if you take cyanide, you are effectively dead in minutes. And here's how it works. Cyanide attacks the mitochondria. Mitochondria, so the electron flow, the electron transport chain stops working immediately because the cyanide binds that, literally stops the flow of electron transport. So ATP collapses, which results in organ failure and death literally in minutes. So I always said, well, the mitochondria shut down, you shut down. This is even in the presence of oxygen. So the clinical question is simply, what would happen if you reduced mitochondrial function? Wouldn't it make sense that if ATP is reduced on any level, it's going to affect your energy? Of course, and we know that. So what does affect the mitochondria? Toxins, we talked about that. Air pollution, heavy metals, mercury, arsenic, cadmium, lead, the list goes on and on. Mycotoxins. My wife would have me talk to you about mycotoxins, for an hour and a half. It's that important. Mycotoxins like mold exposure, etc., are found everywhere. They're so pervasive, and molds like ochratoxin A depolarizes mitochondria immediately. Almost all mitotoxins or mycotoxins affect the mitochondria very, very profoundly, which again would affect ATP production, which would affect every single part of your cellular output and your energy. Medications, antibiotics. You do a course of antibiotics, the chances are your mitochondria have taken a hit. Why? Because mitochondria are bacteria-like in nature. When we went from single cellular organisms to multicellular organisms, the idea of that is all multicellular organisms, it was the translation or the movement of the mitochondria as a bacterial species in our environment into those cells that allowed the cell to then grow and become multicellular. So we have this external reference point, which is bacteria-like in nature. So if you take an antibiotic, by definition, you're affecting the mitochondria. Statin medications, so common, most cholesterol medications will affect will affect your mitochondria. And again, one of the reasons why almost every functional medicine provider will recommend their patients that are on statins take things like coenzyme Q10 or CoQ10. Chemotherapy, which is relevant in my work, antiretrovirals, valproic acid, antipsychotics, antidepressants, these all affect fatigue. And, and even the latter, the antidepressants, when we think about depression or chronic depression, when fatigue is one of the cardinal symptoms, and when we couple that with antidepressants, which further can affect the mitochondria, especially antipsychotics, if first generation antidepressants aren't working, then the condition in that patient typically will get worse. Infections, sepsis, viruses, SARS, COVID, long COVID is really, for the most part, likely a mitochondrial disease. And lifestyle, like I said earlier, sleep dysregulation, circadian misalignment when we talk about shift workers, overtraining, physical inactivity. And again, a great when we talk about biometrics, something like the Whoop as an example that measures, things like resting heart rate, steps, obviously, but one thing that a lot of the new biometric devices measure um, is heart rate variability. And what you'll see is if you do a course of antibiotics, or if you don't sleep well, or et cetera, your heart rate variability will go down. And what we want is a higher heart rate variability. And typically, energy and recovery is related to heart rate variability. But really, taking a step back, it's related to this. And that's why we know that. And one thing that we see with all of our patients that wear Whoops, and if you wear a Whoop and you're watching this webinar, just watch this. After you have your IV, you'll be blown away. The very next day, your heart rate variability is almost always higher. Why? Because you're affecting a lot of these mechanisms, but you're also hydrating. So again, lifestyle plays a big role. And now, as with the introduction, the advent of better and better biometric devices, we're going to see how this interplay is actually happening, so that we really can slow down the rate of aging in a very sort of scientific way. So let's move on to chronic stress and its relationship to the adrenal glands. And the adrenal glands are these two little organs that sit on top of the kidneys, and we can kind of see them here in this image. The kidneys are orange, clearly they're not orange, and the adrenal glands are purple. Adrenal glands also aren't purple. But these little organs, every time you get stressed, every time you face stress, every time you're under chronic stress, they are being squeezed and they are releasing cortisol into the system. Eventually, they fatigue. And I'll start here. Actually, let's see if I can. Yeah, this is a better example. So this is a normal cortisol curve. So we can see we wake up in the morning, cortisol spikes. And what we see here are the ranges denoted in red, and we see the normal cortisol curve in green. And this would be, again, a diurnal cortisol. You wake up first thing in the morning, you'll see cortisol elevating throughout the night. You wake, and it's that cortisol spike partly which wakes us up in the morning. It's also when you release cortisol, which is a corticosteroid, it takes the glycogen, which is a store form of sugars in your liver, releases it into the bloodstream. So you're actually waking up and you're actually having sugar into the bloodstream, which is keeping you regulated. It's also why typically blood sugar is higher in the morning, which is a concern for a lot of people with metabolic disease, high fasting insulin, and diabetics, of course. And probably why you probably don't need a stack of pancakes with maple syrup first thing in the morning, because you're already dumping sugar from your glycogen into the bloodstream. So again, we can see this would be a normal cortisol curve. Under chronic stress, what we can see is the adrenal glands are squeezing and pumping out more cortisol. So we're seeing greater than the normal curve. And this continues until you get chronic fatigue, which means you're getting that morning cortisol and then it's depleting. And again, classically, you're going to see 1, 2 p.m. right after lunch, that fatigue just hit. And that's a very stellar example of the chronic fatigue where you're needing more and more caffeine just to keep going. And ultimately, it results in burnout, where you're just not even producing enough cortisol to be functional. Um, and really, we do see a lot of situations like these, and these patients need to be handled and managed very gingerly. The idea, irrespective of how good our IV formulations are, the idea that one IV will help someone with diurnal cortisol burnout is ridiculous. We need to better manage the expectations of our clientele and our patients to know that they're going to need a treatment plan and a support network to be guided through this. I've seen it take as long as 18 to 24 months to recover from cortisol burnout. So this is a real thing, and we have to progress slowly. So we want to look at the cortisol curve. Cortisol is going to almost always affect the thyroid. Again, measure T3. It's going to result in metabolic changes because if you're pumping so much cortisol, it results in more insulin, which results in more inflammation, which results in more fat storage. And it becomes, again, a vicious cycle. And we see hormone suppression, suboptimal levels of DHEA and testosterone almost always. So when we were reformulating the IVs and looking at fatigue in particular, it's very clear you can imagine now that my clinical focus was on addressing the mitochondria and addressing the adrenal glands. And when we audited all of the IV formulations that were out there in North America, US primarily, they were not very good. In fact, some of them were terrible. And most really don't deliver on the promise of their name. And I'm going to explain that because when you're, if you call something the power pack or you imply that it's going to affect energy, then really you want to be infusing nutrients that are related to energy production and support of the ATP, support of the adrenal glands, support of energy metabolism, metabolic support, and support of the hormones and specifically the mitochondria as well. So we want to recharge the adrenal hormones. We want to support the mitochondrial ATP production. We want to replenish all lost vitamins that come from chronic stress. And really, that's how we develop the Power Pack. So in the Power Pack, we have vitamin C and B5 in high components. And if you watch my video on the Power Pack, I sort of go through all of those components as well, like why we used vitamin C and B5, because those are nutrients that are found in high concentration in the adrenal glands. So we know we could support them. Same with B6 and B12. They are part of the energy metabolism. Magnesium is related to almost 300 energy production or energy functions in the body. Zinc and taurine. Taurine especially. Taurine is a great underutilized amino acid found in high concentration in cardiac tissue. Taurine gets depleted and again can provide steady energy and neuroendocrine support. And we're going to talk about glutathione because oftentimes the chronic stress results in something called oxidative stress. Oxidative stress is just like it sounds. Too many free radicals where oxygen loses part of its electron and becomes damaging. It's the reason why smoking is harmful. It's also the reason why if you're in the sun all day and running marathons all day, inducing oxidative damage, you're going to look older because, again, of the damage of that oxidative effect. And we know that we need to address the mitochondria. And when we talk about the mitochondria, we talk about NAD, we talk about glutathione, we talk about L-carnitine, CoQ10, B vitamins, magnesium, and zinc. These are all essential cofactors for the electron transport chain in the mitochondria, which is producing your ATP. So we really can't have a proper energy plan if we're not combining adrenal and mitochondrial support. What does that look like? Well, in terms of mitochondrial support, we went through that in terms of the glutathione, which again, glutathione is perhaps the most important nutrient that almost everybody should be infusing if you're not sensitive to it. Now, glutathione is our body's main antioxidant. It depletes as we age. It's critical for detoxifying almost everything through the liver, in the body, affects the brain. It is the kidneys. Not in, I can't think of one single client and or patient that won't benefit from glutathione. Glutathione is so powerful that it has to properly be used and not administered initially at such high dose because it can radically, bind on the toxins and detoxify them. And then when we think of the mitochondria, we then move to NAD. NAD, NNR, and the IV and IM, so intravenous and intramuscular precursors, they fuel the actual mitochondrial pathways. So they help repair those things. And that's why you can have NAD IVs. And it's really why NAD IVs have become so popular because people really, really see a radical difference in their health, even vision. How you like you could be having a vision test, and the clarity after NAD is almost mind-boggling. Uh, you have to be careful again with risk of cancer patients or patients that have active cancer or history of cancer. Typically, we won't use NAD because, again, NAD can drive that mechanism. Another thing that affects the mitochondria is L-carnitine, and again, moves fatty acids into the mitochondria. Coenzyme Q10 typically is given by an injection. B vitamins with both IV and IM, and again, magnesium and zinc, like we talked about. Frequency of care. So my ideal frequency for let's talk about that chronic burnout case. In that, if we were sort of working backwards, in that severe fatigue, we need to first support the hormones, and then we need to do IVs in lower frequency. I may even start with a debut with a burnout and then move to the power pack. And then from power pack, I would then add on the glutathione. And then after we have the power pack and the glutathione, I would then alter that with NAD, even if it's NAD intramuscular, which is at a lower dose, and then move on to the IV frequency. In terms of frequency, some of the worst cases of fatigue that we've seen, again, have required two, sometimes even three IVs per week. Um, but general rule of thumb for chronic fatigue, that's pretty significant. I'll do 1 to 2 IVs for at least 6 weeks and then evaluate progress. And like I said, it's really important that that IV is targeted, and it's easier to target it if you have assessments from the doc or labs that we can run through the medical directors and or nurse practitioners working through the DRIPBaR. Um, but having that assessment can really make a difference because then we can better tweak the levels of B12, better levels of magnesium, zinc, etc. And hormones, especially. If testosterone is completely depleted, it's going to be hard to rebuild the adrenal glands in that 52-year-old female who has chronic fatigue. Or the thyroid. Do we need to support the thyroid with selenium or iodine or other nutrients that affect the thyroid, especially if they're functional hypothyroid? And sometimes, and again, in Canada, we can use IV selenium. IV selenium is not available in our US strip bars. But again, the key is to find that right combination of nutrients that will support the patient. And the worse the fatigue, the slower and longer the process. It really just makes sense. So frequency of care can be 1 to 2 drips per week for 3 to 6 weeks, then taper down. But it really depends on where that client or patient is at and who's helping manage it. If it's a referral from a doctor or an outside clinic, they may just say, we want adrenal support and mitochondrial support, 1 to 2 drips per week, and that's what I do when I'm sending referrals to other drip bars. If it's general energy, look, you're probably going to be on some kind of a membership, right, where you're doing it every other week. But I almost always recommend starting with weekly. And if fatigue is the first issue, start less. I love the debut. The debut is almost a classic Myers formulation, but with better osmolarity. So you're getting the hydration, you're not overwhelming the system, and then you can build those other nutrients in. Also gives the client time to get labs done if they're relevant so that we can take a look at those and better assess the nutrient need. And you always want to tailor the experience if you can. I mean, an IV this isn't rocket science. I always tell our patients, like, I'm making the IV formula based upon your clinical concerns, but also your labs. I'm looking at the labs. If it's depleted, we have to figure out why is it depleted, but it's very easy to top up. And again, we can also use IV nutrients in a very clinical and therapeutic way that we're not able to with other modalities. And again, general energy, IV every other week or IV once per month with IM shots accordingly, depending again on what you need. Beyond the bag, and this is where I'm going to talk about botanical medicine. Botanical medicine is one of the most underutilized, you know, medicines really. So plant medicines aren't used as much as they should. And what an adaptogen is, and adaptogens are really um, nature's miracles. Essentially, an adaptogen can take your cortisol, and if it's low, can increase it, and if it's at high, can decrease it. In other words, it will adaptogenically or adapt to the demands of the body. That's the type of intelligence that's intrinsic in the DNA of the plant as it affects our body. It really is a miraculous thing. And classic adaptogens that I like, especially with fatigue, is ashwagandha or withania, because withania or ashwagandha will also affect the thyroid in a really good way. Rhodiola is the classic, a naturopathic adaptogen for high cortisol in that first stage. Eleutherococcus, again, is a great adaptogen, and adrenal glandulars. So oftentimes for thyroid, we'll use desiccated thyroid or armor thyroid, as you've heard, and it's the whole thyroid supplement. So typically Synthroid is prescribed, which is just T4. The issue is that T4 is not your active form of thyroid. So if we use desiccated thyroid or the glandular, it's all of the thyroid. It has T4 and T3. So it provides a better clinical outcome for most patients because oftentimes those patients that have issues with Synthroid is because they're not converting properly T4 to T3, which again is a nutrient deficiency. Oftentimes B vitamins, oftentimes zinc, oftentimes magnesium. And adrenal glandulars, in a similar way, are adrenal glands that can affect, again, adaptogenically, how the adrenal gland can heal. And again, this again depends on what your cortisol is doing, where you are in that stage from high stress to burnout. And all of these can be recommended by the healthcare providers at your DRIPBaR through Fullscript. So it's amazing. And I'll share with you just an example of one. This is through Orthomolecular, again, not to favor any company. But this, I bring this up because really this is a good formulation. We can see the adrenal, we can see Eleutherococcus rhodiola, Schisandra, which is a great adaptogen as well. Licorice root, love licorice root. Licorice root is a very, very useful and powerful formula. I can't tell you how many patients, especially young females or younger females, that had issues with blood pressure, chronic fatigue, um, stress intolerance. We use licorice root. Again, the caveat for licorice root is watch blood pressure, not recommended for those that naturally have higher blood pressures. But again, what else does this formula have? It has pantothenic acid, so B5. We said that B5 is found in high concentration in adrenal glands, and 350 milligrams, that is a good dose. B12 as methylcobalamin, which is the better form of B12. B6, which we talked about, niacin or B3, vitamin E, A, and C, which are again antioxidants to support the oxidative stress. This, by definition, is a really good formula. And again, you need to understand first what the needs are and then find a formula that dovetails to those particular needs. Hormone support. Now, we've talked about hormones, we've talked about testosterone and thyroid. These are all available either on site at DRIPBaRs, depending if there is a nurse practitioner or medical director on site. But all DRIPBaRs have medical directors overseeing things. And as a consequence, in the US, we have something called DRIPBaR Direct, which is an amazing resource for everyone. From GLP-1s to testosterone to other supportive hormones, they can all be prescribed wherever you are, right from Alaska to, the Florida Keys. So take advantage of that. If you don't have a medical provider that you can see directly to help you with hormone support, and if hormones are causing some of this issue, reach out to DRIPBaR Direct. you'll be glad that you did. And again, metabolic support. These are some of my favorites. Berberine, a plant medicine or plant alkaloid, very, very powerful. It's called poor man's metformin, but really berberine is a unique plant medicine all on its own. Curcumin from turmeric, again, powerful anti-inflammatory. Both berberine and curcumin affect how our body uses insulin, affects insulin fasting insulin, even IGF-1 or insulin growth factor. And again, the GLP-1 analogs like tirzepatide and semaglutide, which are available through DRIPBaR Direct, they reduce inflammation. So we're seeing GLP-1s, especially at lower doses. Again, because GLP-1, because it affects glucagon and insulin and sensitizes insulin, can be used in very profound ways to help healing. It's not always, doesn't always have to be used at these heroic doses, because if you're getting side effects or adverse effects from the GLP-1, you need to bring it down and do other things. Where people get into trouble oftentimes, and I see this with our patients, is when they over rely on the medication to do all of the heavy lifting. And that's true whether it's a cholesterol medication or a blood sugar medication or an insulin regulator like GLP-1. You really need to do as much as you can in terms of lifestyle. And in terms of that, even IV support and IM support, which takes the pressure off. So even if we have a patient on a GLP-1, we want them doing metabolized IVs or similar, depending on what their needs are. So again, all available through DRIPBaR Direct. And rebuilding cortisol rhythm, so important. From taking the time in the moment just to put down the phone, to look at morning light. Um, we are an organism that requires natural therapeutics, sunlight, outdoor exposure. Um, and no matter how bright your lights are inside where you're working, it does not compare to the photons which hit the back of the retina from outdoor exposure. And again, we need to be outside and we need to reset rhythms. I do love the red light panels. They're found in a lot of the drip bars, and I just think that they are just so phenomenal to help rebuild that cortisol and that diurnal pattern. Um, Consistent wake up time can make a massive difference, as can consistent sleep time. Managing caffeine. Caffeine is overused. There's no question. You need to manage that. And again, even using adaptogens can help mitigate the effects, the adverse effects of caffeine. Red light therapy, we talked about. Nutrition cannot understand or possibly, state the importance of nutrition in affecting that, increasing protein, decreasing refined foods, refined carbohydrates, and hydrating, whether that's through IVs or oral or both. You need to hydrate. It will affect energy in profound ways and our healing. So we're here to help. If you've enjoyed this webinar, reach out, send us a message at info@thedripbar.com. You can follow us at the Drip Bar. You can follow my handle at wellnessdoctor.ca. And for those that are interested in some of the work that I do with high dose vitamin C and cancer, that's a reference to where the book can be found on Amazon. So check it out. And I really do explain sort of the importance of, in really simple terms too, because I absolutely edited the crap out of this book so that it would be understandable and palatable to people that really need to understand how do these metabolic therapies affect supportive cancer, and how does IV vitamin C work in terms of supportive cancer. And finally, special offer. So you've been here, you've gone right to the end of the webinar, and hopefully you didn't fast forward right to the end, but if you did, way to be creative. So the special offer is fatigue. And if you say fatigue at any of your nearest drip bars, you will get 10% off any IV package. So whatever the package is, whether it's normally 15% off or 20% off or 25% off, and again, it depends on what package is, you will get an additional 10% off for watching this webinar and using the code FATIGUE. So that's it. Thank you for your time in watching this webinar, and I hope that you can understand it. And again, we have a great um, videos on the power pack. So if you want to be able to sort of share that with your friends, just reach out. We can send you the link for that. I'm not sure whether it's on YouTube or on our socials, but we have sort of an explanation of the power pack. And I hope that you got something out of this webinar and can begin to now understand where you start, how you build your ideal frequency, and how the drip bar can support you through that. Have an amazing day, and until next time, wish everyone the best.